You're very welcome to the Firm and Fast Golf Podcast. I'm your host, Shane Darby. Today's episode is another instalment of our Old Dead Guys series. This time we're going to focus on some of the life and times of Dr. Alister MacKenzie. I'm very pleased to be joined from Adelaide, South Australia, by the golf course architect, historian and author Neil Crafter. The Crafter family have a strong pedigree in Australian golf. Neil's father Brian was a golf professional and golf course designer. His sister Jane became a touring professional in her own right on the Ladies PGA Tour. Neil would also represent Australian golf with distinction, in addition to following in his father's golf design footsteps. Crafter has been centrally involved in the development of the MacKenzie Chronology project. During the course of this episode, we will explore Dr. Mac's life and times, focusing on his medical and camouflage career in the military, and onwards to becoming a golf architecture hobbyist. This hobby quickly developed into a career as one of the first batch of golden age pioneers that reimagined golf in England, Ireland, Australia, USA, Argentina and beyond. We're going to examine MacKenzie's formula for success, his 13 principles, the selection of competent, local, trusted partners, the utilisation of the British and American golf construction companies for construction purposes of courses. These companies incidentally were operated by his brother Charles MacKenzie. MacKenzie's design legacy is more than the sum of the courses that he touched. He was one of the first to equate the visual beauty of a golf course with its underlying design. Through his writings, he has left a template and legacy that has inspired and motivated the likes of Tom Doak, Bill Coore and Ben Crenshaw, Clayton DeVries and Pont, Crafter and Mogford Golf Strategies, and many more. We really do hope you enjoy the show and that by its conclusion you might have learned a little bit more about Dr. Alister MacKenzie. Many thanks for tuning in. Neil Crafter, you're very welcome to the Firm and Fast Golf Podcast. How is your summer of golf progressing so far in Adelaide?
Thanks, Shane. Thanks for having me. And summer has been a little bit dismal so far in Adelaide. It's been quite cool and not too much swimming weather, but we make the most of it.
Excellent. Listen, just before we get cracking with a few questions about yourself and indeed the good Dr. Alister MacKenzie, I'm interested to see that the Cliffs development on Kangaroo Island has recently broken ground and slated for opening towards the end of 2024. Given the devastation that was wreaked by the 2020 bushfires in King Island, I was really delighted to hear this news. What do you think the addition of the Cliffs to King Island will mean to the South Australian golfing landscape?
Look, I think the Cliffs will be a great addition to our golf. Primarily, Adelaide is the centre of golf in South Australia. We've got a number of good courses up the Riverland and down in the southeast of the state, but Kangaroo Island is a bit of an uncharted territory as far as good golf goes. And, it's a terrific site that they have, and I think the Cliffs will encourage more golfers to come to South Australia, and that means more golfers will want to play some of our better courses here in Adelaide as well. So I think it's going to be of considerable benefit to golf in this state.
Well, having had the pleasure of an extended trip to Adelaide in January 2020 and got to play a couple of your golf courses and sample a couple of your Barossa wines, it really is super place to base yourself for a bit of golf and a bit of relaxation. It's just that little bit more manageable size wise than maybe Melbourne and Sydney.
Yeah, we like the size of Adelaide. It's sort of partway between a sleepy country town and a big metropolis, but we like the size of the city, and we're fortunate to have some great wine areas to the south and to the north of Adelaide. And like you said, you can have some fantastic time visiting wineries, going to beaches, playing some great golf as you did when you visited.
Listen, I'm sure many of our listeners know who you are. For those that don't, perhaps you could give us a quick introduction to help out those that have not yet come across Neil Crafter.
Yeah, look, Shane, my background is golf. My dad was a golf professional. My uncle was a golf professional. My cousin was a golf professional. My sister is a golf pro. So, we've sort of been a golfing family, the Crafters. And from my side, I played representative golf as an amateur for Australia and South Australia. So I had a good amateur golf career, but my dad encouraged both my sister Jane and I to get a profession behind us, and I studied architecture and practiced as an architect for a number of years. But then I was able to transition into golf course architecture, primarily at the inspiration of my dad, who, as a golf pro, had to be a jack of all trades, teaching, club repairs, TV commentary, and golf course design. So, I watched him drawing plans on the kitchen table after dinner. So that was really my inspiration to get into golf design.
I guess, as you said, with Brian, your dad being a professional golfer and course designer, it's probably no surprise that both yourself and your sister Jane took quite successfully to golf. Just interested to understand what your earliest memories of the game are.
My earliest memory is when I was about 4 years old. Dad took my sister and I to a little par 3 pitch and putt course at North Adelaide on the banks of the Torrens River, and we went out there for a hit. And I still remember to this day that Dad managed a hole-in-one on one of the holes. I can't quite tell you which one, but it certainly stuck in my memory. I thought, well, that's fairly obvious. That's what you're supposed to do. You aim at the flag, you've got to hit it in there. So fortunately, I didn't have too many hole-in-ones in my career, just managed 2. But that was sort of my first memory of golf.
That's some introduction to the game, an intro that it makes it look so bloody easy.
Exactly. Unfortunately, I was later to find out that it wasn't quite so easy. You have to work pretty hard at it.
There's that famous commentary by Wayne Grady many, many years ago at the Open Championship. And, he said, when contrasting a good day versus a bad day, he goes, on the good day, you think you've all the questions. On the bad day, they've changed the bloody questions. Listen, I'm just interested to understand how you got interested in golf course architecture and the history of the game. Was that through your dad, or did you have any other influences?
The influence was certainly there from my father as far as golf course architecture, but the history of golf is something that I kind of took on myself, really. And I since the early days, I've become, as I get older, I've become more interested in the history of golf, the history of golf course architecture. Collecting various things, in particular collecting stuff to do with Dr. MacKenzie has been one of my collecting habits, I suppose. But certainly the research into early golf architects and early golf in Australia has been something that I've harnessed over a number of years now.
Given that we're here to chat about Dr. Alister MacKenzie, as you said, I should probably ask you a question about him. What do you think Dr. Mac means to golf in Adelaide and South Australia specifically?
Well, look, he means a lot to golf in South Australia. But if you did a poll of 100 golfers, not too many of them, I suspect less than half a dozen, would actually know the name Dr. MacKenzie and understand who he was and what he did here in his time in South Australia, or more broadly in his time in Australia. So, but for those that do know him, certainly they're well aware of the influence that he had on golf design in this country, and it was quite significant.
Yeah, and we'll get to the 2.5 months that changed the continent in a chronological order in a wee while. Just like to take a look at the Alister MacKenzie Society and the MacKenzie Chronology specifically. I know you've been centrally involved in creating the definitive timeline of Dr. MacKenzie's life, which has been entitled the MacKenzie Chronology, which I understand was developed through the Alister MacKenzie Society. What can you tell us about the Society and the inspiration behind creating the chronology?
Shane, in point of fact, there's actually two Alister MacKenzie Societies, which sounds a little bit confusing, but there's one that was originally based in America, but it's a worldwide group with a membership of around 15 clubs from the US, Britain, South America, Australia and New Zealand. That was set up in 1995, but then 4 years later, a group of clubs in the UK decided to set up the Alister MacKenzie Society of the UK, and that these are for clubs that can demonstrate a significant involvement by Mackenzie in their design heritage. I think at the moment they have some 62 clubs as members, and they also have individual membership. So under the auspices of that body, they commenced the MacKenzie Chronology project, and the 14th revision was the one that I first got involved with, but it was started by Nick Leaf of Al Woodley in Leeds and Bob Beck, who is the historian at Pasatiempo in California. And in those days, before searchable newspaper archives, they had a much harder time of finding out information about Mackenzie. But I guess in the last 15 years or so, we've been able to add significantly to the knowledge of Mackenzie's whereabouts and figure out what he was doing, whether it was in his private life or his work life. We now have such information that we know, the time of trains that he caught to go to particular projects. We know whether he gave a lecture in the afternoon or the evening on a particular date. We know from newspaper archives that he and his wife were a guest at a wedding and what present they gave the bride and the groom. These sorts of things are just amazing repositories of information, and we've been able to glean, I guess, the information in regards to Mackenzie's life and put it in a location where it's freely available to people on the Alister MacKenzie Society of the UK website. You can download a free copy of the chronology, and each time we do an update, the new version is uploaded. So it's a great resource.
Maybe if we go back to where it all began, the 27th September 1870, Alister MacKenzie, Alexander, to give him his Christian or his name, was born in Normanton, West Yorkshire. What can you tell us about young Alister and the Mackenzies of Lochainver?
Well, Alexander was named after his paternal grandfather, and he had no middle name. Quite a common Scottish thing to name the firstborn child after the paternal grandfather. He was the eldest living child of Dr. William Scobie Mackenzie and his wife Mary Jane. Unfortunately, an older sister, Margaret, who was born in 1869, died a month later. And then when Alexander came along, he was the first living child. Fortunately for us, he survived. Possibly he didn't live as long a life as we would have all hoped. I'm sure he hoped to live longer than he did. But when Alexander came along, he was baptised at the All Saints Church in Normanton. And then more brothers and sisters arrived. William in 1872, Marion the next year, Mary in 1875, and finally Charles in 1876. But all the children were motherless that year because Mary passed away from heart disease. So At a later date, their father remarried, but they had a young loss in their lives. Alexander was then educated at Wakefield Grammar School starting there in 1881. So that's a little bit about the young Alister. Lochinvar, it lies on the west coast of northern Scotland on a small sea loch from which it takes its name. The region was the MacKenzie clan's ancestral lands from around 1670 until the Battle of Culloden, and the title of the lands passed to lairds that had no real connection to the land. Lochinvar eventually came into the hands of the Duke of Sutherland, but Mackenzie's ancestors flourished, and his grandfather Alexander in fact became the Duke's ground officer for the parish that contained Lochinvar. And so the Mackenzies were able to indulge themselves in pursuits like salmon fishing, deer stalking, pursuits that were usually reserved for the aristocrats. And this enabled William Scobie to be sent to medical school. The Mackenzie family always considered Lochinvar home, even though they were living in Yorkshire.
The good doctor would obviously follow in his father's footsteps into the sphere of medicine, at least initially anyway. And we will get on to his post. And actually, interestingly, it would appear he only started really playing golf at the age of 28, despite obviously being at Cambridge and whatnot, studying medicine. I'm just interested, having immersed yourself in Mackenzie's life, I'm just trying to get an overview as to, or to get a feel for the sort of person he was.
Yeah, you're reliant on written accounts of other people who met him, interacted with him. There is there tends to be a thought of Mackenzie as a bit of a shameless self-promoter who would list a golf course on his resume if he just drove past it. So there's that side that he gets a bit of bad press on. And while he was pretty good at promoting his services, my research has confirmed that all the courses that he claimed to have worked on in the various brochures that he put out were in fact all true. He didn't just drive past them, he definitely worked on them. So from contemporary accounts, including ones from those few months in Australia, they depict a fairly jovial and friendly man, one who played up his Scottish heritage and his Scottish brogue, certainly to the benefit of his golf course design. But he was certainly dedicated to promoting the game of golf and the ideals of strategic golf design, and in implementing those in a way that mimicked nature, because he was very much on the lines that the work that was done by the best golf architects should be indistinguishable from nature. And he was that was one of his major tenets of his design. As a sideline, he loved dancing, and he won a number of competitions with his second wife on transatlantic liners that he went to and fro from Britain to America in the late 20s and early 30s. So something that you wouldn't suspect looking at him, that he was a dancer, but was very good at it, apparently.
A twinkle-toed devil, by the sound.
Exactly.
I was interested, just in preparation for this chat, Neil, Joshua Pettit's Mackenzie Reader was published a couple of years back, and in the introductory section there's a letter that Alister's sister Marion wrote after he died, actually, and she posthumously remembered the good doctor as large-hearted, generous to a fault, hot-tempered, but no backwash from it. Quickly up, it was over in a moment.
Indeed.
A pretty passionate individual, by the sound of that.
Yes, indeed. He certainly, I can imagine that he didn't suffer fools lightly. But I think that if there was some humour and perhaps a glass of scotch, then he'd be a happy man.
While studying at Cambridge, Mackenzie, as we mentioned earlier on, unlike many of his golden age design contemporaries, was not actually a member of the Oxford and Cambridge Golf Society and was considered only an occasional golfer up to and including the age of 28. Golfers often assume that in order to design courses, one must either be an elite amateur or a professional golfer. Obviously, Alister was neither of these things. Indeed, the same can be said for Tom Doak, David McLeod-Kidd, Mike DeVries or Ali McIntosh these days. Having been an elite amateur yourself, do you feel that it's easier for better players to appreciate the limitations of weaker ones, or vice versa?
Well, look, I think from my perspective, having I can still remember starting out in the game, and I can still remember not hitting it very far and the challenges that brought. But I can also, remember playing, high level amateur golf and playing in open championships with professionals, etc. So I think I can put my mind into both the better golfers and the shorter hitting golfers' mindsets. And realistically, you've got to be able to do both if you're going to be able to design golf courses these days. And that's sort of that's probably one of the major challenges, is being able to provide courses that have sufficient interest for the low handicap scratch marker who hits the ball an astonishingly long way these days, and the shorter hitters who are probably reaching with their second shots where these longer hitters are hitting their tee shots. So that's certainly a challenge. But I'm grateful for the golfing background that I've had, and I think I'm better off for it than not having it.
Interesting that you mentioned the increased distance that the ball is going these days. I'm trying to recall, and it might have been a podcast with Sean Tully that I listened to some time ago, and he was making the point that perhaps Mackenzie designed golf courses are a little bit more immune from needing redesign than other golden age contemporaries. Sean felt that Mackenzie bunkering from, say, the 20s and 30s held up pretty robustly to the increased distance and courses in general. Would you find that, or would you concur with that?
Well, look, there are certainly Mackenzie courses that have been changed a little over the years, but there are others. Take Augusta National. There's not much of Mackenzie left at Augusta apart from his routing. All the greens have been rebuilt. Every bunker has been rebuilt. Every tee has been rebuilt, and some a number of times over. So, look, I don't think you can draw hard and fast conclusions from that. But you take a course like Royal Melbourne. It was torn apart by Ernie Els maybe 15 plus years ago when he shot 62 in one round, and people were saying, "Oh my goodness, it's the end of the world." Royal Melbourne is now defenceless, but it's not really the case, and it really depends upon how they set the course up and the wind, etc. Because the great courses like that, yes, they're on limited footprints. They're not able to be expanded to the length if you were building a brand new championship length course, given the distances that the top pros hit the ball these days. So, look, I think they hold up very well. I think most of Mackenzie's courses have held up well over the years. So, yeah, I tend to probably agree with Sean on that front.
From a design perspective, we might just have a quick look at how the Mackenzie's experiences during the Boer War in South Africa would feed into his creative process. So obviously he served in the British Army during both the Boer and the First World Wars as a medic, and later as an advisor both to the Royal Engineers and subsequently as a lecturer at the Army Camouflage School in London. During the campaign against the Boers in South Africa, he became fascinated how they used camouflage to obscure troop positions and confuse the British enemy. You might talk about how MacKenzie used the principles of camouflage to the benefit of his golf course design career.
Yeah, MacKenzie was massively influenced by what he saw during the Boer War. As he was a medic attached to the Somerset Light Infantry, and he saw that the Boers were not regimented in the way that they would use camouflage, and they would use it in a way, as you said, to confuse and disguise what they were up to. But they did it in such a way that it all looked perfectly natural and undisturbed. And so the Boers would just sort of pop out of nowhere, literally, and they'd win skirmishes and battles this way. So it clearly affected him, and he was certainly looking at how to use it in to his benefit in golf course design, and ways to make golf holes more interesting, but to also within that interest to be able to trick golfers from time to time with the use of visual perspective and methods to trick the eye, the trompe l'oeil approach, make things look further away, make things look closer, etc., so that when you're hitting a shot into a green, that a bunker might be disguised so it looks like it's at the front of the green, but it might actually be 10 or 15 paces short of the green. Golfer would think they've carried the bunker, and they come up and they find their ball short of the green. They haven't taken enough clubs. So these are sort of some of the devices that we're still using today as golf course architects. We're still trying to mimic those elements that people like MacKenzie introduced into his design. What we need to remember is that between his time in South Africa around 1901 and the commencement of World War I in 1914, he'd already really established himself as one of the upper rank of British golf course architects. So he was very active through the years 1912, 13 and 14. And the war probably couldn't have come at a worse time for him. He'd just really got his business going. He'd been able to essentially go from a weekend architect where he was working Saturdays and Sundays, but in the week he was still a doctor, to be able to put his medical practice to one side and really become a full-time architect. And World War I kind of interrupted him, but he was first called up as a medical officer, but he soon pushed to get himself transferred into the Royal Engineers because he had the passion for camouflage, and he wanted to try and improve the lot of the troops that were in the trenches, and how to make better trenches that would confuse the enemy in the same way as the Boers had done to the British back in South Africa. So that was really his passion, and that's really how he spent his war, was battling uphill against the bureaucracy of the British Army, who had manuals as to how you build trenches, everything in straight lines. And as we know from MacKenzie's design ideals, straight lines are anathema. Nature comes in curves.
Apropos of that utilisation of the theory of camouflage in conjunction with golf course design, I recently came across 2 Twitter posts by Tommy Naccarato, which I believe illustrate the sort of visual devices that a camoufleur such as MacKenzie utilised as part of his design process and approach. I'll actually put a link to both tweets in the show notes if anybody is interested to take a look. Maybe we can take a look now at the All Woodley project. As you said, MacKenzie at the time is essentially a part-time architect, moonlighting as an architect, but still having the medical job midweek and the main source of funds, as it were. He was a member of both Headingley and Leeds golf clubs. However, his increasing understanding of golf course architecture unsurprisingly seems to have led to a number of disagreements between Mac and the respective club committees as to what should be done with their specific territories. Surprise, surprise. MacKenzie believed that Leeds golfers deserved better than what was available to them. This leads us to the start of 1907 and the formation meeting of the All Woodley Golf Club. What can you tell us about the machinations of the good doctor's first golf course commission?
Well, it wasn't really a commission for him, I guess. That really came with the next project being Moortown. He was never commissioned as the architect of our Woodley. He kind of took over the role, I suppose, would be the best way of describing it. But the idea for a new course in Leeds came from a group of very prominent Leeds men, bankers, solicitors, doctors, architects. And he felt passionately that there would be more suitable ground for another golf course in Leeds that was more gently undulating and had more suitable subsoil for golf compared to the Leeds Golf Club's course at Roundhay, which was quite rustic on quite hilly land. So he dedicated a number of hours to explore around the Moortown and Elwoodley villages. And he eventually found a parcel that was uncultivated, covered in moorland grass and heather, and it lay within Lord Harewood's estate. And his group set about leasing that land and formed the All Woodley Golf Club in 1907. MacKenzie became their first honorary secretary, and he also held a role on the Greens Committee. Interestingly, the committee that they set up was what they described as a permanent committee, and if you wanted it, it was your job for life. So there weren't regular elections as we suffer in most golf clubs. Woodley had a permanent committee, and if you wanted to leave it, yes, you could leave it. And then within that committee, they'd appoint a replacement. So you could go on for 10, 15, 20 years, depending on how much you could stomach looking after a golf club as an unpaid committee person. So what the committee did was to commission Walter Toogood, who was the professional at Ilkley Golf Club, to lay out a course. And what exactly he did isn't really known with any certainty, but he more than likely staked out a layout for construction to start. But MacKenzie and his friend Arthur Sykes, who was also on the committee, they were far from happy with it. Initial course, and they managed to persuade their fellow committee men to agree to bring up Harry Colt from Sunningdale. And Colt really was, in those days, really one of the few people practicing as a golf course architect, albeit he was still managing Sunningdale and really only working as a part-time architect. So in July 1907, Colt came up to Leeds. He stayed with MacKenzie at his Moore Allerton Lodge house. And unsurprisingly, Colt supported MacKenzie and Sykes' views on the layout. And while the committee initially agreed with Colt's suggestions, they soon after they passed some resolutions that were contrary to those Colt suggestions, and they gave MacKenzie and Sykes instructions as to the work that was going to be carried out over the winter of 1907 and 08. MacKenzie later recalled that none of the committee, fortunately, went near the course in the winter, and so he and Sykes were allowed free rein, essentially, to do what they wanted. Their greenkeeper didn't know anything about golf. He hadn't worked on a golf course before, so he didn't have any preconceptions, and so they were able to instruct him as they saw fit. So when it was ready for play in the spring, the committee first came out and saw the course, and some of them were absolutely furious. MacKenzie wrote that we felt that if we could hoodwink them into believing the artificial features we had made were actually made by nature, we could get away with it and escape their hostile criticism. But they decided, well, if MacKenzie can have his expert in Harry Colt, we'll get our own. And they brought up Herbert Fowler, and he, rather than criticise the course as they expected, he supported it and called the result a triumph for all concerned. So that kind of tended to squash the criticism, but generally it was still a fairly difficult relationship going forward. Eventually, the course settled down, but his first role in building a golf course was fairly surreptitious in the end, that he was doing it behind the committee's back. But luckily, he had a good idea about what he was doing, and the end result is there for all to see. One of his greatest courses was his first.
Your previous comment there regarding the greenkeeper brings to mind flat greens and village idiot.
Yes.
Let's move on to Moortown in 1908, obviously the next project that MacKenzie was involved in. And I think we really start to see some of his practical flair for marketing in terms of what happened, at least initially, at Moortown. Only £500 had been raised from membership dues. And obviously this was not enough to build a good golf course, to MacKenzie's mind. However, it was enough to build a great hole, which would attract additional members and additional funds, hopefully anyway. So MacKenzie resolved to build one hole, and that hole was and is now known as the Gibraltar hole. What can you tell us about MacKenzie's work at Moortown?
Well, Moortown certainly was his first commission after his working his way into a debut at Alwoodley. Another group of local men that MacKenzie referred to as tradespeople, even though they were perhaps not doctors and lawyers like the Alwoodley, but they were probably a little bit more than tradesmen. They found this land. It was not far from Alwoodley, and in October 1908 he first inspected it. He said he felt he could design a fine course on the land, but there were a lot of difficulties to overcome, especially regarding drainage. MacKenzie became a vice president of the new club, so he had a hand in all of these clubs on the committee at Alwoodley, a vice president at Moortown. He poached George Franks from the green staff at Alwoodley to be the new head greenkeeper. So I don't know how well that went down at Alwoodley when he pinched one of their good men. So they began work on getting some temporary holes in place so that they could at least be out there hitting some balls. But his Gibraltar hole was his first permanent hole, and built in the early first half of 1909. And like you said, the attention that it attracted, certainly nationwide attention, was sufficient to get some excitement amongst the locals to join and pay their membership funds. Herbert Fowler again visited Leeds. He looked at Moortown while it was still being built in December 1909. He wrote about it in the Sheffield Telegraph and was also full of praise for it. I can say that a number of holes were sited over a heather bog, and much drainage work had to be undertaken to get a solid base to these holes, and the turf for these came from a neighbouring field. MacKenzie, with the help of Franks, devised a horse-drawn turf cutting machine that could cut around an acre of sods in 4 hours, much quicker than you could do it by hand. They also invented a mole drain that was towed behind a horse to make a drainage channel within the soil, and that was around a tenth of the cost of doing it manually. The committee there also arranged for Colt and Fowler to view the new course. In those days, it seemed like they needed to get the stamp of approval from these established architects like Colt and Fowler for new projects. Both came through and expressed their approval, and then eventually the course was opened in September of 1910 to quite rave reviews. So MacKenzie's first projects were very successful, and he was on his way.
I'm going to jump forward to 1913 and Sitwell Park. So my apologies to anybody out there that's looking to hear about what MacKenzie was up to between Moortown and Sitwell Park. If you wanted the podcast to be 6 hours long, we might go through course by course. We're not going to do that. But obviously MacKenzie was synonymous with what were actually colloquially known as MacKenzie Greens. Seemingly whether he himself had designed the greens or indeed somebody else who had similar design flair for green contours. The Sitwell Park Golf Club is located in Rotherham in South Yorkshire. It was home to one of MacKenzie's more colourfully contoured greens, until it and a few more of its siblings were completely flattened. Many years later, Renaissance Golf would recreate the Sitwell Green on the 13th hole at Barnbougle Dunes in Tasmania. I don't know what all the fuss is about that. Myself and my mate both birdied that hole on my one and only trip to Barnbougle Dunes thus far. Just wondering what you can tell us about the most famous of the Sitwell Park greens.
Well, MacKenzie went over the top, I think, is probably the best way of describing it. The greens that he was building in 1913 were extremely contoured, and they were built on quite steeply sloped locations, and MacKenzie decided that the best way to build greens in spots like that were to break the greens up, make them large, but break them into zones, and essentially there might be 5 or 6 different zones within these bigger greens, and each zone was quite a hollow, separated from the next hollow by a ridge. And so you can imagine a series of, well, not quite bomb craters, but near craters stretched up and around and over a large green site. And that if you were able to hit a good shot and it worked its way into the hollow, it may well finish within 5 foot of the hole, leaving you a nice putt for birdie. But if it ran on the other shoulder and shed away from the hollow that the pin was cut in, you might have to putt through another hollow, up over a ridge, down into another hollow. 2 putts, 3 putts, 4 putts, or even worse, could be your fate. There was quite a debate in the local newspapers in Sheffield. Someone roundly criticised MacKenzie's greens. He then wrote a letter to the editor. That person then replied. It ended up in Golfing magazine. They took up the cudgels as well on MacKenzie's behalf. So there was quite a to and fro with MacKenzie suggesting that these greens were eminently fair. But unfortunately, the facts of life were that he wasn't paying the bills. He wasn't a member of these clubs playing them every week. And fortunately, World War I intervened and saved his greens for a few years. But early in the 1920s, around 1921 and 22, they modified these greens at Sitwell Park. There were at least 4 of them that were significantly contoured like this. I've identified the 4th, the 12th, 15th and the 18th greens, and he also built one at an adjacent course called Renishaw Park, which was the ancestral home of George Sitwell, who Sitwell Park was named after and had financed the Sitwell Park club. He built a new green there, the 9th, and that was similarly perhaps blighted by these hollows. And eventually they were all changed. And I think we find the post-war MacKenzie greens are much more toned down, much more playable, much more subtle, because he'd built greens at Moortown and at Allwoodley that were, the epitome of interesting, playable, puttable greens. And he kind of took his ideas. Unfortunately, he experimented with them, and they didn't really prove successful, and fell by the wayside. And he went back to his more proven green designs after that.
It's humorous just to think, and I suppose it's a recurring theme that sort of seems to echo through time a little bit, apropos what happened a number of years after MacKenzie revised Lahinch. I believe the great old amateur John Burke, who was a member in Lahinch, went out a couple of years after MacKenzie left and flattened all of that lovely contour that you spoke of as well.
Yeah, and there was you can look at that and say, well, they were Philistines for doing that, but back then, 5 or 10 years after MacKenzie had left, MacKenzie wasn't the revered figure that he is nowadays, and an original MacKenzie green gets accorded almost archaeological sacred site status compared to a mere mortal's green. And in those days, if John Burke wanted to flatten the green, well, they let him do it.
If we move on to 1914 and quite possibly MacKenzie's international coming of age somewhat, I kind of felt, given the fact that the Kaiser family are soon to open a reconstituted Lido course at the Sand Valley Resort in Wisconsin, I thought it was timely to mention that Alister had entered a competition that the Country Life magazine ran during the spring of 1914. What can you tell us about this particular competition?
Well, Charles Blair MacDonald, I guess really an American golf icon, one of the founders of the USGA, an early US amateur champion. He was good friends with Horace Hutchinson and Bernard Darwin, who wrote a regular golf column in Country Life magazine. And MacDonald had suggested to them that a design competition could be run under the auspices of Country Life for the design of a 2-shot hole, a par 4 in our terminology, that would actually get built as a hole on his new Lido course on Long Island in New York. And the Lido was quite a marvel of construction, with most of the sand imported from by pumping from offshore. It was a very expensive and complicated process. And so MacKenzie put his design in. His was a very elaborate design. It was a hole along the seashore that featured no less than 5 different lines of play, including one out onto an island. The green itself was large and subdivided into 3 separate sections, perhaps not quite Sitwell Park sections, but big differences in level between the 3 sections. And his design obviously impressed the 3 judges, Darwin and Hutchinson and MacDonald himself. But the design did come in for some criticism. Charles Allison, who a few years later would be MacKenzie's partner in Colt MacKenzie and Allison, he described it in a newspaper review as a fantastical scheme that surely must have been drawn by the doctor as a joke. But MacKenzie was in fact deadly serious, and winning that competition gave him recognition across the UK and certainly into the US as well. And McDonald did build a version of the hole, albeit somewhat modified, as his 18th on the Lido course. But sadly, it was short-lived. But as you point out, it's being recreated at Sand Valley, and as I understand, the whole course is now turfed, and won't be long before it opens for play, and we'll be able to go and play a replica version of MacKenzie's Lido design. So that'll be quite amazing. Great job they've done there with Tom Doak and the guy, I can't remember his name offhand, Peter Flory, I think, who essentially recreated a computer model of the course. So quite an undertaking. So be worth a look, I reckon.
Absolutely. And you mentioned Charles Hugh Allison there, which is a nice sachet into our next particular section. MacKenzie was design partners with Harry Colt and Charles Allison between the years 1919 and 1923. Golf obviously boomed as it seeped out of Scotland and into England, Ireland, Wales and beyond at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. The early days of golf design in the 20th century saw a move to more inland properties in the UK. Historically, early inland courses were characterised by Victorian course design sensibilities that exerted ever-increasing levels of punishment on weaker and less accurate golfers. It's no wonder that through the influences of Lowe, Colt, MacKenzie, Fowler et al., the design in the name of golf became more interested in strategy, fun and enjoyment. What can you tell us about MacKenzie's 4-year partnership with Colt and Allison?
Well, I guess the first thing I can tell you is that even though it was 4 years theoretically, it had really broken up probably after 3. It seemed a partnership that was really destined for failure. I think MacKenzie probably was more of a lone wolf than any of the other partners. And I think it was certainly a partnership of convenience. I think that's probably the best way to describe it. And I think they felt that coming out of World War One, that the best way to capitalise on the potential for new golf courses was to kind of make a super team, if you like, of certainly Colt and MacKenzie as two of the best known architects. Allison, probably the least known of the 3, but still a very talented and dedicated architect in his own right. I suspect that it started with good intentions. MacKenzie said at the end that it was only ever going to be a 4-year partnership, but I think that's probably just a kind way of looking on the fact that it kind of had irreparably broken down probably by 1922 at the latest. They were even instances of MacKenzie and Colt competing for jobs while they were still in partnership. So it seems quite a strange way of doing things. And it wasn't even a geographical based partnership, like saying, well, Allison, well, you're in London, so you'll take care of those courses. Colt, where he was looking after his area, Alister in the north, and in Leeds, you look after the north. No, well, MacKenzie was working, had a number of projects in London for the partnership, but there were signs of collaboration and cooperation between the 3. We've got instances of MacKenzie going to Scotland for some of his projects and spending time in St Andrews doing some work on remodelling of the Eden course at St Andrews and the new course that were Colt projects. So we've got instances of him doing inspections for Colt. At times during the Berry Golf Club that MacKenzie designed, we have Alison coming along and doing a number of inspections when MacKenzie was busy elsewhere. And so there were certainly signs that that there was collaboration, but on the other hand, it was, I guess, a difficult partnership to keep together. And I think MacKenzie wanted to get out, and I'm sure the other two thought about it the same way. And officially it was broken up in 23, but I don't think it functioned as a partnership, at least for the last year or 18 months.
During the period of partnership with Alison and Colt, MacKenzie published his first book, Golf Architecture, Economy in Course Construction and Greenkeeping. The book, I believe, was repurposed content which was created for 2 lectures given to the Golf Greenkeepers Association in Leeds in 1912. It appears that the book was one of the very first published books on the topic of golf course architecture. What do you think we can still learn from this book some 100 years after its initial publication?
Yeah, well, look, MacKenzie's book was, it was his little green book, I suppose, his version of Chairman Mao's Little Red Book. And MacKenzie always had copies of this book on hand. When he travelled, he'd give away copies to people, and it was sort of his calling card in a way. Certainly you'd find these days a number of copies that are actually autographed by him with the author's compliments, that he's presented it to people, to golf clubs, etc. So there was, he used it for promotion, but I think he was quite anxious after World War I finished to get something out into the realm of a publication. Colt wrote the foreword to it, and as you said, it was really the text was really written before the war. There are a number of pre-war photographs included in it, a couple that are post-war, early sort of 1919 type projects before it was put out in 1920, and around the same time, Colt and Alison put out a book. MacKenzie contributed a chapter to it on, I think it was on labour-saving machinery, going back to the mole the drainage mole, and the turf cutting machine that he wrote about. So all 3 partners essentially had a book out in those early post-war years. What can we still learn from it? Well, look, his 13 points are, I guess, his most famous contribution. And if you go through them today, they're still very relevant. I think we can still learn a lot from MacKenzie's 13 points. And some of them are perhaps a little bit dated, but most of them, are still applicable today.
He seems to be very adept in choosing or picking or collaborating with local partners, be that in the UK or farther afield. I suppose when you look at it, Harry Colt utilised the Franks Harris Brothers Company to construct his courses. MacKenzie obviously understood the need for consistency and control throughout the process of golf course construction. So much like the design-build approach in evidence today, he appears to have had a skill for both attracting and selecting local partners who understood what he was trying to accomplish and could oversee a project and deliver it, I guess more importantly, after MacKenzie had left site, often never to return. One such partner was his younger brother Charles, who would become managing director of the British Golf Course Construction Company, with Alister as a shareholder. His American partners would of course subsequently include Robert Hunter, Perry Maxwell, H. Chandler Egan and Bobby Jones, not to mention Alex Russell and the Morecambes in Australia. What can you tell us of Charles MacKenzie and how he fits into the good doctor's chronology?
Well, the point that you make there, Shane, is a very good one. MacKenzie had an exceptional talent for identifying partners, and if you look at the partners that he worked with, you see that they ultimately became, great golf course architects in their own right. Certainly, his younger brother Charles was pre-war was involved in a landscape company with a guy called James Nicholson, and they certainly had started getting involved in golf course construction before World War One, and Charles MacKenzie's firm certainly constructed projects for MacKenzie, but it wasn't really until he left the partnership that the relationship really got close, because we find a number of MacKenzie projects for the partnership were built by the Franks Harris firm. So we see that as MacKenzie started to become his own man and out of the partnership, that his brother's firm, with him involved, starts to build all of MacKenzie's courses wherever he can possibly get them involved. And cleverly, that way he gets a cut of the construction budget as well as the design budget. So, we see some, as you mentioned, we see similar things happening today. So C.A. MacKenzie and Co. eventually changed their name to the British Golf Course Construction Company. It sounded a little bit more, upscale than just naming it after I suppose he probably disguised the MacKenzie connection a little bit by naming it that way. They certainly, they never built a project that wasn't a MacKenzie design. So, if the British Golf Course Construction Company or their future relative being the American Golf Course Construction Company, if they built a course, MacKenzie had designed it 100%.
MacKenzie revered the old course. Interestingly, he made no changes to the course, and according to the life and work of Dr. Alister MacKenzie, Tom Doak's book, he positively discouraged any changes. I do know that in addition to the course survey, MacKenzie also gave input on championship pin position options for the old course. How did this seemingly brief appointment as consulting architect to the R&A materialise, and did MacKenzie have any other involvement with open rota courses?
Well, first and foremost, MacKenzie was an R&A member. He was put up for membership, nominated by Harry Colt, in fact. So he obviously was a part of that establishment. But he wrote a letter to the management committee proposing that he would draw a detailed survey map of the old course for a fee not exceeding 30 guineas. And in December 1922, that offer was accepted. So between then and the completion of the plan in March of 1924, MacKenzie must have spent a good deal of time surveying the course and recording its features. But he was a very busy man at this time, and how he managed to find enough hours to, and obviously it wasn't just down the road for him, he had to make a trip to Scotland to look at the old course. So it was quite remarkable that he was able to make the time to make this survey. It's known that he used two artists to undertake the final drafting of the plan, one of whom was his friend and colleague from the Royal Engineers Camouflage School in World War One, a fellow by the name of Major Adrian Klein. Klein had actually drawn, would later draw a series of Mackenzie's plans from South America. So the plan was eventually presented to the RNA on the 12th of June in 1924. But by this time, Mackenzie had thought about whether he should be charging his club a fee, and he decided very generously to offer the plan as a gift to the club instead, and this was gratefully accepted. And as far as I know, the plan hangs to this day in the Secretary's office, unless, as you say, Martin Slumbers doesn't like the look of it, but if he wants to get rid of it, I'll take it off his hands. But apart from this contribution, we've not been able to find any evidence that he was appointed, the consulting architect to the RNA. And as you mentioned, he was philosophically totally opposed to making any changes to the old course. He revered it, and he couldn't think of any improvements that you could make to it. So it's a short involvement, but really one driven by his love of the old course. And the plan itself is magnificent. It's huge. I don't know the exact dimensions of it, but it pretty much covers half a wall. And the reproduction that we see, the engraving, it really doesn't do justice to the original. It's quite remarkable, but you don't see it. I think it's a very well kept secret, that plan. But I have seen images of it, and it's a lovely rendering.
Yeah, it would be remiss of me as a proud Irishman not to speak about Mackenzie and his time in Ireland. And I guess it's sort of somewhat self-serving in that, having had limited exposure to Mackenzie courses thus far, it's a little bit easier for me to speak about things that I've seen and know where they are. Mackenzie's former partner Harry Colt revised and built some of Ireland's great and best golf courses. Colt was originally introduced to Irish golf by his friend Cecil Barcroft, the then secretary manager of Royal Dublin, with whom he did some design work in France in 1911. Colt's Irish commissions would ultimately include Royal Dublin in 1920, Royal Belfast in 25, revision of Royal County Down in 1925, new course in Beaver Park in Belfast in 1927, County Sligo in 1927 also, and two new golf courses, the Dunluce and the Valley courses for Royal Portrush from 1929. Then we get to Cork City, which is, geographically, for those that are listening and don't know, a huge amount of the geography of Ireland, down in the sort of middle south of the country. It appears that Cork City in the south of Ireland couldn't get enough of the good doctor and his able construction foreman, an Irishman by the name of Jack Fleming, who was born in Tuam, County Galway in 1896. Dr. Mac would design 4 courses in Cork City over the years 1924 and 1925. Douglas, Muskerry, Cork Golf Club and Monkstown. And to this day, the 4 courses referenced above are still the best 4 courses in Cork. What can you tell us about Mackenzie's time in Cork and how Jack Fleming fits into the MacKenzie chronology, both in Cork and farther afield?
Mackenzie's first project in Cork was Muskerry, and August 1924 he arrived there, and then the other golf clubs got wind progressively of what Mackenzie was up to, and in June 1924 Cork heard that, or Cork Golf Club heard that Muskerry was bringing Mackenzie over, so they invited him to have a look at the course. And then Douglas in October 1924, they invited Mackenzie to look at their layout. And finally, Monkstown, they were the last to come on board. But by this time, all 4 had, you've heard of the expression keeping up with the Joneses. Well, this was really a case of, well, if they've got them down the road there, we better have him as well. We don't want to let them get too much of a head start on our course. So it was very fertile ground, both for Mackenzie and the the British golf course construction company. I understand that Jack Fleming was recruited in Manchester, and he worked initially as a timekeeper for the company on the Cavendish golf course that they built for the Duke of Devonshire in Buxton. And then they brought him over to Ireland for all their cork projects. So he was in Cork for a couple of years. And after they wound up, opportunities then arose for Alister and his brother in the US, and soon they'd formed the American Golf Course Construction Company with Robert Hunter's son, Robert Hunter Jr., as the managing director. So all of the principal players in MacKenzie's US project, MacKenzie and Hunter, and his brother Charles, Hunter's son, all had a hand, all had a hand in the trough, so to speak, of the money that was flowing for design and construction at this time in California. Fleming had a major role to play as supervisor of some of MacKenzie's famous projects, including Cypress Point, St. Charles in Winnipeg in Canada, and Sharp Park in California. And Fleming remained at Sharp Park after it was built as the golf course superintendent, and eventually he became an architect in his own right and was highly regarded in California. But then MacKenzie did other projects in Ireland as well. There's a suggestion in the Cork history book that Fleming worked at Youghal. Don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
That would be Youghal, but good try.
I'm just looking at it, reading it as Youghal, but Youghal, that sounds like you're from the south of America. You say, hi, Youghal.
Phonetically, that would be the correct pronunciation. That's absolutely perfect from a pronunciation perspective.
Yeah. So there's a suggestion that Fleming worked there, and if Fleming worked there, there's a likelihood that it was MacKenzie designed that as well. We haven't really been able to confirm that much more. And then we've got Lahinch and Limerick. But he was very active in Northern Ireland as well. You've got Balmoral in Belfast from 1919, the Knock Golf Club and Malone Golf Club and Royal Belfast in Belfast. Royal County Down Ladies Course, he gave advice. And even before Harry Colt got to Portrush, he given Royal Portrush advice on improving there and making the course more difficult ahead of an All-Ireland Championship scheduled for 1919. So certainly his time in Ireland, the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, was quite lucrative for him.
No, for sure. And one of the jewels in his crown would most certainly be the revision at Lahinch in and around 1926. Lahinch was founded in 1892 when members of the Black Watch Regiment laid out the original golf course. Old Tom was involved and in fact designed a new course for Lahinch in 1894, and this new layout acted as a catalyst in the foundation of what is still known as the South of Ireland Amateur Championships, which are still held at Lahinch at the end of July every summer. Just interested to understand, what do you know about what the works that MacKenzie was commissioned to carry out at Lahinch in 1926?
Well, I think MacKenzie's brief at Lahinch was to improve the golf course, and he essentially abandoned the holes that were on the inland side of the road, and he brought all of the golf course onto the seaward side. And to do that, he had to go into Dunesland that hadn't seen golf before. If you look at some of the very early photos of the establishment of Lahinch in the late 1890s, it's a very rugged and rustic golf course. And MacKenzie, I think, was quite smitten by the land that was unused at Lahinch, and so he set about designing some terrific golf holes, but there were some that were quite difficult, some greens that were difficult to hit. It certainly received some criticism from golfers in that in that amateur championship, the South of Ireland, that they played there each year. And so his holes were, while we would like to have seen them all preserved in the form that they were originally built, unfortunately the locals in John Burke got to them and softened them, flattened them, and it's a shame that happened. And I think, as you said, Martin Hawtrey's endeavoured to reinstate some of that influence, but once it's lost, it's really lost. It's hard to. It's always hard to recreate it from impressions, I suppose, when I don't think it was terribly well documented. I've not been able to find. There seems to be very few, if any, photographs of the course from around this time. It's not something that seems to have been well documented, which is a shame, because all we've got is some newspaper descriptions to go on as far as what those holes were like.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Two other noticeable courses that MacKenzie was involved with in Ireland. One is the Limerick Golf Club, where I believe he designed a number of holes. The balance of holes were actually designed by Commander John D. Harris, who interestingly began his design career with Frank's Harris Brothers Golf Course Construction Company that we referenced earlier on. As an aside, and I'm reaching a little bit for this one, but Harris also designed Wairaki in Taupo in New Zealand, and I believe he was an early mentor of Peter Thompson at the beginning of his course design career. Now, one question I have for you, and it's Galway Golf Club, and in some circles it's referenced as a cult, but others refer to it as a MacKenzie. Do we know who Galway Golf Club can be attributed?
Yes, this has sort of recently been resolved with some finality. I think Adam Lawrence, who's writing a biography of Harry Colt and researching his courses. This was discussed recently in a bit of an email chain with some Irish contributors as well. And it's pretty clear to me that it's a Harry Colt design. There are a number of contemporary sources by way of newspaper correspondents who refer to Colt as the architect. And the only MacKenzie reference is a fairly obscure one within the club history to a past captain recollecting that a golf course architect by the name of MacKenzie was involved. But I'll take the contemporary newspaper references as a trumping those other that other source, and I'm very happy for it to be attributed to Colt.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for clearing that up. We might move on to the proverbial 2 months that changed the continent. Tom Doak's book on MacKenzie doesn't hold back on his hyperbole by describing the adventure as a 2-month period that changed the continent. I wouldn't disagree with this tenet as long as you're a golfer, and a shorthand for the subsequent impact that still resonates to this day. What can you tell us about Royal Adelaide and the site at Seaton prior to Dr. Mack's arrival in 1926?
Well, if I can just jump back to your first comment of quoting Tom Doak, that it was a 2-month period that changed the continent. I think this was really the first visit to Australia by a recognised golf course architect. The previous architects that had come out, well, they were really golf professionals. They'd come out around the turn of the century from Scotland, and golf architecture was never really their strong suit. And you had guys laying out golf courses who had some idea, but they were not of the level of design philosophy that MacKenzie was at by the time he came in 1926. And it would take until, I think, 1959 when the American architect Dick Wilson visited Australia for the Metropolitan course for another overseas architect to influence golf design in this country. So, yeah, it was. I don't think it changed the continent, but it certainly changed golf on this continent and how we looked at golf courses. Royal Adelaide and their site at Seaton, they were amalgamated with the Glenelg Golf Club and playing on a very rudimentary course at Glenelg, and the course was leased, and they wanted somewhere that they owned. They wanted to, they had greater ambitions for their club. At that time, they were only the Adelaide Golf Club, but they still had greater ambitions, and they identified a site at Seaton. It was sand dune land with flatter areas around it, some swampy ground, but it was certainly ideal for golf. And they laid out a course in around about 1906, and one of the prime movers of the move was a wealthy Adelaide man by the name of Herbert Lockett Rymel. And Rymel went on to become a golf course architect in his own right, the founder and designer of the Kooyonga Golf Course. He laid out the Glenelg Golf Course as well as the Grange Golf Course. And so his involvement in golf in Adelaide is quite significant, having had a hand in all four of our best courses. So the course at Royal Adelaide before MacKenzie arrived was seriously bunkered. It had hundreds of bunkers. If in doubt, put in a bunker was kind of the mantra. So it was very heavily bunkered, but there were aspects of the site, a couple of one or two sand craters that hadn't been used. And so MacKenzie set about using those elements better, but he made some, what I would think are fairly basic errors in his design. He put all of the holes onto the onto one side of the railway line, so that you didn't have to cross it during your round. And unfortunately, the space that was there really wasn't enough to safely put all of the holes. And so there were elements of his design scheme that were never incorporated. But there were other elements. They picked, essentially, I think they picked the eyes out of his scheme, and they implemented the best parts and left out the worst parts. So well done to the Royal Adelaide Committee of the day.
I had the pleasure a number of years ago of spending 6 or 7 days there, and it's a phenomenal layout. So it is. We have noted a recurring theme with MacKenzie seems to be the quality of his local partners that he was able to collaborate with. One such partner was Alex Russell, who would become MacKenzie's local Australian partner, and the designer in his own right of courses such as Royal Melbourne East, like Carrinyup in Perth and Parapara Umu Links in New Zealand. Once MacKenzie left Adelaide, do we know whether Alex Russell or indeed Mick or Vern Morecambe ever went back to assess the implementation of the suggested improvements and perhaps suggest a few more of them for themselves?
Well, Alec Russell was certainly out and about. He was one of the best amateurs in Australian golf and had won the 1924 Australian Open at Royal Melbourne. So he'd beaten all of the pros. So he played in very many tournaments across the country and certainly had played the course Royal Adelaide after a number of the changes had been made, and he was consulted by the club. They've certainly got records of him visiting and writing reports about the course. But it was a number of years after Mackenzie's visit that he did that. It wasn't like he was there the next week to implement it. The golf club, they did that work on their own bat, and then Russell came in a number of years later to comment on it. But I think, as I'd mentioned before, in the case of Royal Adelaide, they did well in terms of implementing the best parts of his scheme and leaving out the worst.
I know Tom Doak has been involved at Royal Adelaide over the last 10 years or so. How much revision has he undertaken, and has it been in an effort to try and reconnect with some of those old sketches from 26?
Well, look, I think we backtrack a little bit further to that. Mike Clayton was engaged to implement a golf course master plan that he had based essentially on implementing Mackenzie's 1926 plan on the ground, and a recreation of it, if you like. And they bit off a lot with this, and they basically built an entirely new 17th hole, replacing the par 5 that was there with a long par 4 based on Mackenzie's plan. And it was really not well received. It didn't seem to fit into the character of Royal Adelaide, and the members hated it. And as a result of that, Clayton's master plan was abandoned, and they brought in Tom Doak to redo that hole, and he redid it. And the work that he's done has certainly improved it, but I still personally preferred the par 5 that was there before it. But that's really just a personal opinion. Tom hasn't done all that much work, or his Renaissance firm haven't done all that much work there in recent years, but they have done some work in joining a number of fairways together, removing roughs and things like that. And I think the look of Royal Adelaide has certainly improved since his involvement.
Maybe if we could take a look at some of your own work at Metropolitan in Melbourne. Mackenzie would visit the Metropolitan Golf Club during a short visit to Melbourne, and I understand that he suggested a number of modifications that were gradually implemented post-visit. Yourself and your design partner Paul Mogford are currently engaged with the Metropolitan Golf Club. What can you tell us about the work that your company Golf Strategies has undertaken since your appointment in 2015?
Look, our appointment at Metropolitan has sort of been twofold. The first stage, I guess, was to basically redo their entire practice facilities, which we've now completed. It's taken a while, but we got there eventually. And the other project out on the golf course was really to implement what we called a course enhancement plan. And essentially what we wanted to do with this course enhancement plan was to identify the strengths of the golf course, identify the weaknesses, and see how we can bring those weaker parts of the golf course up to the character of the remainder of the golf course. Because appreciating the history of Metropolitan, you start to understand how the course was modified. A compulsory land acquisition for a high school took some very good land, and the replacement land that they got was flatter, had less character. They brought Dick Wilson out from America to design these holes, And while he designed some quite interesting holes for the course, he wasn't involved in the implementation. He was back in America doing his thing, and the club themselves were building these changes. And unfortunately, they never really quite got the balance right. And really, there've been a number of changes to these holes over time. Some have improved things, some haven't. And really, our brief was to try and unify the course better, so that you know when you're playing some of these back nine holes, you don't feel like you're on a sort of a second grade metropolitan, but you're part of the feel and character that you see on most of the front nine.
When I was over in Australia, I actually had the pleasure of playing golf with somebody you might know from Metropolitan, Campbell McIntosh, who I believe is involved on the Greens Committee or the Links Committee. I'm interested to understand, I believe you were trialling some grass varieties in terms of potentially changing the grass variety on the greens in Metropolitan, is that
yes,
correct?
they've been considering that for a number of years, and I think they're getting closer to a total greens reconstruction and reprofiling and returfing. This is my partner, Paul Mogford, that this is his project, because obviously he's just down the road from Metropolitan. I don't get over to Melbourne all that often, and certainly in recent years with COVID, travel has been very difficult between states in Australia. But certainly we're hoping that work will happen in the next 6 months or so.
You know, I'd just like to take a quick look at Mackenzie in South America in the 1930s. Obviously, people will probably be aware of his work, or at least have heard about his work at the Jockey Club of San Isidro in Buenos Aires and Club de Golf del Uruguay in Uruguay. I'm kind of interested just maybe to take a look at the plans which I read about in a Thomas Dunn article on the plans developed for Enrique Ancorena's estate at La Boqueron. What can you tell us about that?
Well, El Boqueron was a private course. It was actually a 9-hole course that had been laid out by the Englishman Percy Boomer in the early 1920s. And when the family learned that Mackenzie was in Argentina, they contacted him through some intermediaries, I think other family members that were actually on the committee of the Jockey Club, and they got Mackenzie to agree to come out and visit El Boqueron with a view to redesigning the existing course. There's some suggestion initially that this was a totally new course. It was actually a redesign of an existing course that Percy Boomer had designed for them. And Mackenzie created a mini old course for them, essentially. Double greens, quite fantastic design, beautifully rendered, drawn up by Adrian Klein back in England, and then the plans were sent back out to South America, and the plan, through some fortuitous digging by an American golf professional who was living and working in Buenos Aires, he was able to source this plan, and it's quite a remarkable find. Even the guest book with Mackenzie's signature in it, they were able to find. So quite remarkable. But yeah, certainly golf in the 1920s in Argentina was booming. Mackenzie did other designs there as well. Club Mar del Plata, a 27-hole design. Club Nautico San Isidro on the River Plate. He designed a very elaborate 18-hole course that even included his a hole remarkably similar to his Lido design. But unfortunately, the River Plate was really not the location for this, and they had massive flooding problems. And Luther Kuntz, who was the engineer from Wendell Miller's organisation, Miller was the man who built Augusta National for Bobby Jones and MacKenzie. Luther Kuntz was sent out with MacKenzie to South America, essentially with the commission to build the Jockey Club, build the two courses in a matter of months. But he did lots of other work and eventually stayed in South America and became another MacKenzie disciple as a golf course architect. So, we've got them everywhere: Australia, Ireland, via America, and even America into South America. So, his influence was, as you said, significant.
Yeah, you've set up a nice little segue there into well done into the Augusta National section. Now, we won't labour too long on this, but given that the next men's major is the Masters tournament, I figure it would be remiss of me not for us to take a quick look at the development of Augusta National. The story of Bobby Jones playing both Cypress Point and Paso Tiempo in 1929 while in California for the US Amateur is well told. Common belief was that Jones chose MacKenzie as his preferred collaborator at what was the Berkman's fruit farm at this point in time. I was interested to read in a Golf Digest article in 2021 that it seems that accepted wisdom may not quite tell the whole story. What can you tell us about the letter that Bobby Jones sent to Sir Guy Campbell, who was another British golf course architect, in December 1930?
Well, I believe that this letter does not refer to Augusta. So Jones refers in his letter, or mentions in his letter, that he's considering purchasing an interest in a hotel and resort project that has an existing 400-room hotel near Atlanta. And it already has 2 golf courses, and he wants to build a new championship course to go with it. So I believe the assumption of the Golf Digest article that this refers to Augusta National is not right.
So it's clickbait is what you're saying?
Well, I don't know if they did it as clickbait, but I think their assumption that the project is automatically Augusta National. Well, firstly, Augusta didn't have an existing 400-room hotel on it, and it certainly didn't have 2 existing golf courses. So, and it's not really near Atlanta either. So I think it's very likely this reference is to another investment opportunity that Bobby Jones ultimately didn't go ahead with. So I think it's a furphy, and I don't think Jones was certainly corresponding with Sir Guy Campbell and wanted to give him an opportunity on this other project, but it wasn't Augusta.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Crafter. That clears that up 100%. Prior to his death in January 1934, MacKenzie was completing the manuscript for his second book, while also trying to extricate the balance of his design fees from Clifford Roberts and the Augusta National Golf Club. The aforementioned manuscript was lost. However, it was unearthed in the 1990s by MacKenzie's step-grandson Ray Haddock. What can you tell us about this find and what we now know as The Spirit of St. Andrews was eventually published some 60 years after its initial completion?
Well, I think MacKenzie had certainly finished the manuscript before he died. He had given some parts of it to Golfdom magazine. Herb Graffis was the editor, and they eventually published some extracts shortly after MacKenzie's death. So I think his manuscript was essentially complete. And you mentioned that he was trying to get the balance of his design fees. That's actually most of his design fees out of Augusta National, because I think from memory, I think he was probably only paid about 30% of what he was due, and he was owed something like 70%. of his fees, so it was quite a significant amount. And unfortunately, Mackenzie's last few years were financially fraught for him. He wrote to Clifford Roberts that he was having to play with a Woolworths golf ball rather than anything decent, because he just couldn't afford a new golf ball even. So he suffered badly, unfortunately, in the last few years of his life financially. But that's really a case of probably most of the country suffering through the early 1930s with the impact of the Great Depression. As far as the story of, I'm not exactly certain where Ray found the manuscript, but I think obviously it was in some of his father's belongings, and he recognised it for what it was, and eventually he published it, and it was a great success, and it really takes on, from his first book, Golf Architecture, and really expounds on a whole lot of different subjects. So yeah, it's a fantastic book,
and it's amazing how valid it still is now. Probably interchange Walter Hagen for Severiano Ballesteros, or Tiger Woods, or whatever it might be, but the lessons that are in that book are still very, very relevant to today.
Oh, absolutely. I think it's a book that's stood the test of time. Mackenzie certainly had a view back then and even earlier that the golf ball was travelling too far, and still the case today. I think he would be you'd be shocked at how far the golf ball travels today, but in some ways I don't think he'd be surprised either.
In closing your Mackenzie exposition, Neil, I'd like to understand how you would assess Mackenzie's design legacy and whether and how it still reverberates today.
Well, I think it certainly still reverberates today, and I think the interest in Mackenzie and his work has really never been higher, and certainly his design legacy has stood the test of time, and there are many golf courses that Mackenzie designed that are at the pinnacle of our understanding of what a beautiful, well-designed, nature incorporating golf course should be. Cypress Point is a classic case in point. Certainly a collaboration between Mackenzie and Robert Hunter. Hunter had to put a lot of the work on the ground while Mackenzie was travelling, but the concept that they had and the journey that the golf course takes you on, a landscape journey, and it's really a beautiful, evocative trip around a magnificent site that asks you to play some great golf shots to make pars or even birdies on it. So I think his legacy is stronger than ever, and we're doing our best, and I'm doing my best to try and educate golfers about Mackenzie and his life and his work, and I see that as certainly part of my my mantra is to spread the word about Mackenzie and what he did for golf and what he means to it today.
Regular listeners will know, Neil, that all of my guests get asked the same final two questions. So our penultimate question for today relates to your golf course bucket list. You might let us know what 5 courses appear in your bucket list. It can be less than 5, it can be more than 5. You've plenty of rope here. So,
as in bucket lists that I haven't played yet, or bucket lists that I want to play again before I die?
Well, Either or. Is it return visits or indeed places that you haven't played? So whatever, you can interpret that question however you wish.
Okay. Well, look, I haven't played Augusta National, and as a MacKenzie aficionado, I would like to at least have that ticked off my bucket list. I've been fortunate enough to visit Cypress Point a couple of times, but I would gladly take another trip there any day. Muirfield has always been one of my favourite courses in the UK, and I'd love to go there again. And certainly Lahinch is high on my list of courses, and I'd be remiss if I didn't include an Irish course in this podcast.
Good answer, Neil. Good answer.
Good answer. And, I always enjoy a visit to Royal Melbourne and to Kingston Heath, and so that'd probably round out those courses. I might have listed 6, but you might excuse me.
That's okay. That's okay. I forgive you. I forgive you. Final question relates to 2 golf book recommendations that any golfer should have in their golfing library.
Well, as a simple, easy-to-read book, I can't go past Dr. MacKenzie's Golf Architecture. The 13 points are certainly well worth reading and understanding MacKenzie's core philosophy. So I'd highly recommend that. And the other book that I've always enjoyed reading is Weathered and Simpson's The Architectural Side of Golf. I really like the themes that are developed in the various chapters between Simpson and Weathered, and I love that book. So they would be my 2.
Excellent, Neil. Well, listen, before we let you go, you might just tell listeners how they might be able to keep tabs on Crafter and Mogford Golf Strategies, and indeed Neil Crafter himself.
Well, you can certainly follow us on Facebook, Crafter and Mogford, and I think my partner Paul is on Instagram, although I'm not. We do have a website, so if you search Crafter and Mogford, you should find us. So that should give you a little bit of an idea about our golf design activities. So please get in touch if you do.
Neil, it's been an absolute pleasure to host you on the Firm and Fast Golf podcast. On behalf of the listeners, I'd like to extend our thanks to you for your time today and wish you continued success in your historical, architectural and writing endeavours. Go easy.
Cheers. Thank you, Shane.
Many thanks for tuning in. As usual, you can find us online at firmandfast.golf or on Twitter at firmandfastgolf. Please continue to like, subscribe and comment. It really is appreciated. Until the next time, happy golfing.